People have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways.
Well, what do you mean by believe? Do you mean the words? Do you mean to say the words, I believe in God? Does that indicate that you believe in God? I don't know what you mean by believe exactly. Is what you believe what you say, or what you act out? I act as if I believe in God, or to the best of my ability.
I believe that acting that out fully. Maybe it's not reasonable to say to believers, you aren't sufficiently transformed for me to believe that you believe in God. The way you live isn't sufficient testament to the truth. And people would certainly say that, let's say, about the Catholic Church, or at least the way that it's been portrayed, is that with all the sexual corruption, for example, it's like, really, you believe that the Son of God, Jesus Christ, was the Son of God, and yet you act that way, and I'm supposed to buy your belief.
As far as I'm concerned, what you believe is what you act out, not what you say. And then, and if you're an integrated person, then what you act out and what you say are the same thing, and then you're a person whose word can be trusted.
It seems to me that the church is actually guilty on that account, because the attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation.
Let's say you do believe in God. Are you all in on your beliefs? Are you sacrificing everything to this transcendent entity that you proclaim belief in? Have you cleansed yourself of all your sin, let's say? Are you making all the sacrifices that you need to make? Are all the people who are committing these heinous actions and then covering them up, you ask them, well, do you believe in God? What are they going to say? Well, you'd think the answer would be yes, given that they're priests. And yet, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence isn't exactly so clear. That's no indication of your right to say that you believe. Not all those who say, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think this is why it's bothered me to answer this question. It's like, well, what right do I have to say that, to make that claim? I believe in God. Well, what's the claim? Is that the claim that I'm a good person somehow? Because you'd think that if you believed in God, actually, like seriously, that you'd be a good person, like right now. And so if that hasn't happened in some sort of miraculous sense, so that you're the best person you could possibly imagine being on an ongoing basis, and then terrified of deviating from that path in a serious manner, then I don't see why you have the right to say that you believe in God. A rich man comes up to Christ and says, "Good Lord," and he asks him a question about how it is that he should be a good person, and Christ says, "Don't call me good. There's no one that's good but God." The story in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, and basically what happens in the story of Adam and Eve is Adam and Eve are unconscious to begin with, and they're sort of in this paradisal state. There's no death, or at least there's no knowledge of death. There's also no knowledge of self. And then Eve eats the apple that the serpent gives her, and the scales fall from her eyes, and she gives the apple to Adam, and he eats it as well, so she makes him self-conscious. They both wake up. The first thing that happens is they realize that they're naked, and they cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens as a consequence of that realization is that they come to know the difference between good and evil. To be aware that you're naked is to be aware of your fragility and your mortality. When you have a nightmare about being naked in front of a crowd, it means that you're exposed to the crowd. All your flaws, all your mortal vulnerability is exposed to the crowd for them to see, for you to be ashamed of, for them to judge. So Adam and Eve cover themselves up, and so it's because they've realized that they're vulnerable, they're naked and vulnerable. That's self-consciousness. Human beings are self-conscious animals. See, it took me a long time to figure out why it was that when Adam and Eve woke up, they also developed the knowledge of good and evil. I just couldn't figure that out because it didn't make sense to me. How self-consciousness, knowledge of vulnerability, and the knowledge of good and evil were tangled together. But I figured it out eventually. I thought, oh, I get it. It was like a real revelation to me. As soon as you know you're vulnerable, you know the difference between good and evil. Because as soon as you know you're vulnerable, then you know everyone else is. And as soon as you know that everyone else is vulnerable, you know how to hurt them. And so that means you consciously know how to bring suffering into being. And that's the knowledge of good and evil. Anyways, God gets wind of this and he chases Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But he says some interesting things when he chases them out. He says, all right, what's the consequence of that? And he says to Adam, you're going to have to work. Well, and then, of course, God tells Eve, well, you've really, screwed things up too. You're going to have these big-brained babies, and that's a big problem. You're going to suffer in childbirth, and then they're going to be dependent on you forever, and because of that, you're going to be dependent on this man that you just woke up, and that's not going to be very pleasant for either of you, but tough luck. The thing is, there's a theory in there. There's an interesting theory of suffering that's implicit in that story. And the theory of suffering is that suffering is built into the structure of self-conscious being. It's built right into the structure. So if you're a self-conscious being, that's your lot. It isn't someone else's fault. It isn't a consequence of sociological oppression. It isn't a consequence of the fact that our society isn't organized properly. It's just part of being. So that's a big deal, because that's an important theory, because one of the questions is, well, why is there suffering, and what are you going to do about it? In the story in Cain and Abel, God rejects Cain's sacrifices. Cain goes and complains to God and says, like, what kind of stupid universe did you make here? I'm breaking myself in half trying to get things together, making the proper sacrifices, and nothing's going well for me. And Abel, well, everything he touches turns to gold. Everyone loves him. And God tells Cain, don't be coming and telling me that the entire fabric of reality is wrong because it isn't working out for you. He says, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory cat. That's basically the metaphor that God uses. And he says, and you let it in and let it have its way with you. And that's really an interesting way of putting it, because what God says to Cain is that, you're all bitter and resentful, and really it's no wonder, because, things aren't going well for you. And then you've got Abel, who's overshining you in every way. But yeah, it's your fault. This terrible thing waited at the door, and you let it in. And then you entered into a creative union with it, and you produced something as a consequence. And that's this tormented spirit that you have now. And it's polluting your relationship with reality. And that's why things aren't working out very well for you. So go put yourself together before you come and tell me just exactly what's wrong with the structure of reality. You have more misery than is necessary because you really didn't put your act together, and you know it. And you've done it creatively. And so Cain goes and kills Abel. That's the story of how resentment enters the world. So what do you do about that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it. And try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Make the suffering in the world less.